While folks are coming in, I'm just going to quickly say who I am. My name is Ajay Singh Chaudhary, and I'm a core faculty member at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, specializing in social and political theory. For those of you who don't know our little institute, we're a critical education and research institute here in New York City, and actually now in 6 states, I think. We do seminars and events and courses and all kinds of stuff. So come visit our website, check us out. And I am currently working on a book on the politics of climate change, which is what this is adapted from. But I am going to wait for my proper go signals. That was just a quick. Just do it. All right, cool. So this is called "We're Not All in This Together." In November of 2018, fires of unprecedented speed and ferocity broke out across California. The Camp Fire in Northern California killed just under 90 people and destroyed approximately 19,000 structures. Even with modern safety protocols and building codes, it was the deadliest and most destructive fire in Californian history. The Woolsey Fire in Southern California at the exact same time burned over 100,000 acres. Fires are tricky things to understand. The fires that burn across most of Central Africa, for example, on a yearly cycle are seasonal, mostly contained, and part of a decently maintained agricultural process. Californian wildfires, while certainly nothing new, are not. They might be sparked by simple heat or lightning strike or by recreational accident or by a glitch in the utility grid, but their frequency, intensity, and duration have all unquestionably increased due to anthropogenic climate change. At first glance, the story of 2018 California fires is one in which everyone stands together, rich and poor, black and white, famous and unknown. Media reports observed celebrities like Miley Cyrus, Gerard Butler, and Lady Gaga all losing at least one of their homes, just like everyone else. But among the various cultural legends of the moment, TMZ reported that Kanye West and Kim Kardashian had avoided this particular fate through the intervention of a private firefighting service. This was not some one-off procurement or an out-of-the-ordinary solution. And beyond their staggering wealth, it had little to do with the Wests or Kardashians personally. Over the past decade and a half, major insurance companies like AIG and Chubb have begun to offer private emergency service to elite policyholders. It is one of the most straightforward ways to think about the commodification of risk. Incredibly expensive assets face catastrophic threat. The insurance company packages that threat and sells 2 incredibly attractive products. The first is insurance against climate-related damage. The second is access to services to prevent having to pay out when damage occurs. From the firm point of view, they've sold 2 products at a tidy profit and avoided the exorbitant payout involved with actually covering insured losses. From the client point of view, despite a steep cost, the financial and psychological burden of losing one's home is avoided. For these 2 parties, it is indeed a win-win scenario. However, there are externalities, so to speak, in privatized social services. Such private services skirt or run right over what tiny regulations exist for them. They physically impede and complicate public emergency services. Protecting assets can be at odds with, for example, saving lives. And the same companies lobby for tax and infrastructure policies which necessitate those very companies. Starving the public coffers, which in the case of California, deploys severely underpaid incarcerated people to enhance dwindling state capacity. Although insurance companies and the emergency service contractors themselves focus on the high-end market, they are increasingly creating more affordable, less comprehensive packages for lower tiers of customers. This kind of tiered access to services is familiar to anyone who has encountered private or privatized social goods, like market-based health insurance. And yet it is also an extreme intensification where there is seemingly no bound to direct private governance. In this example, we can see one microcosm of what I call right-wing climate realism. One of the most common misconceptions concerning climate change is that it produces or even necessitates a united humanity. In that tale, the crisis in the abstract is a common enemy, and a perfectly universal subject is finally possible in coming to experience ourselves as a geological agent. The story I am telling you is different. In this story, there is no universal we. Climate change is not the apocalypse, and it does not fall on all equally, or even in a certain sense on everyone at all. The idea of right-wing climate realism may strike you as odd. The assumption runs for many that there is really only one climate realism, and the primary task is to communicate, persuade, and teach the science, from which the one true politic will emerge. All that stands in the way is the intransigence of non-believers. This is perhaps, ironically, a familiar story. It is a Christian story of gospel and evangelism. But the science does not have a single politics. Right-wing climate realism encompasses a plausible and thoroughly realistic, in terms of power and in terms of ecology, set of positions in which a business-as-usual scenario is absolutely worth it. Even given the staggering social and ecological costs, it might even be salutary, and not in some short-term or self-deluded way. Right-wing climate realism, then, is, in its simplest form, a political ecological scenario of the concentration, preservation, and enhancement of existing political and economic power. Although the threat of ecologically articulated right-wing politics is quite real, has historical antecedents, and is visibly present in this moment, much of what should be understood as right-wing climate realism need not be articulated as ecological at all. It can simply build from what the right has already established and wishes to pursue further. This is something we see not only in the Pinkertons and other private security agencies investing in climate-related protection for the wealthy, but something we can observe in tax policies that go far beyond neoliberal catechism. It's not only the US military prepping for climate security scenarios and retrofits, it's the US continued investment in the world's largest existing migrant detention, surveillance, and expulsion network. It's not only the development of what I call detachable infrastructures, luxury survival architecture built not only with internal power generation and potential for stockpiling, but to receive aerial deliveries and withstand floods or riots. It's Amazon's patented airborne fulfillment center, which could connect far-flung supply chains with end-use consumption by drone delivery, furthering the development of ever-diverging narrow luxury markets. Understood within a larger portrait, this is a world in which global capitalism sputters on, working for fewer and fewer, or one of vigilant, restrictive hyper-nationalism, or even structurally neo-feudal, a different kind of post-capitalist vision for if and when the struggling post-growth global economy finally goes under. Or it's a world of all three. This is Fortress Europe, or the US border. It is increasingly direct, punitive post-democratic governance in places like Puerto Rico, Greece, or Flint. It is interstitial border states like Turkey or Mexico adopting the control of migrants as an emerging geopolitical lever, but on a permanent tier below, providing a key service for the preservation of power in a world already experiencing migration on a scale not seen since the Second World War, and projected to be hundreds of millions in the near term. There is tremendous evidence that people deeply invested in fundamental system preservation do consciously proceed with business as usual, knowing with a reasonable degree of certainty the likely climate outcomes. I often jokingly call this the Rex position, named for Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil and former Secretary of State under Donald Trump. Tillerson proclaimed, my philosophy is to make money. If I can drill and make money, then that's what I'll do. Tillerson is not a climate denier, per se. He just doesn't share the urgency of his many critics. Tillerson is more than willing to talk about a shift to renewables, but there's no rush. People will adapt to climate change. There are engineering solutions. It's only those trapped within some kind of other temporality who think otherwise. There are many clear and bright futures for business as usual in the meantime. There's a certain clarity and precision in Tillerson's arguments. Our view reflects the reality that abundant energy enables modern life. The Rex position is not one single positive political ideology, but the convergence point of the politics of right now for a panoply of right-wing climate realisms. The Rex position is not short-sighted or irrational. One does not have to construe Tillerson as evil. Tillerson and those he works with are not in some kind of shadowy conspiracy. The Rex Tillersons of the world have looked at the same data, the same trends, the same underlying socioeconomic conditions, and noticed that in a business-as-usual world, they end up on the winning side of a sharp global and local dividing line. Every structural incentive serves to reinforce such thinking. The best outcome in such a position is to push on, because the costs of climate change will largely be borne by those who already bear the cost today. Indeed, people bearing those costs helped keep the system going as long as possible and advance the Rex position of maximal extraction for maximal maintenance or cash out that much better. Even modestly successful climate mitigation and adaptation for the vast majority of people requires socioeconomic and political changes that pose a steep loss for the Rex position. There might be, among the generously minded, an inclination to see this position as deeply impoverished. Surely, the Tillersons of the world would be profoundly affected by such staggering human loss and damage, let alone the diminishment that is surely a part of the sixth mass extinction event in the Earth's history, in which some 30 to 50% of species may be eliminated by mid-century. In some meta-ethical way, such claims might register. But the systems we have inherited, the world capitalism has built, is not a world which inculcates, rewards, or incentivizes such a mode of thought or its practical applications. If Rex himself felt that way, there are 1,000 Rexes equally well placed, able, and ready to replace him, to help, no matter what the cost, maintain capitalism as we know it in the 21st century. Or, worse, a gradual lateral exit from contemporary capitalism to forms of what might more precisely be termed neo-feudalism, simultaneously extending the life of our current global socioeconomic and political systems as long as possible for maximum real accumulation while cashing out, so to speak, towards more directly coercive forms of privatized rule. In this sense, against both a triumphalist liberal democratic narrative or some forms of Marxian analysis, capitalism would have been a massively costly aberration, a world historical blip that expanded the wealth, power, and size of the ruling class and locked in a niche incompatible with the flourishing of some 7 billion human beings. Through an ecological lens, what Thomas Piketty describes as patrimonial capitalism becomes a horrifyingly distorted mirror image of the green, steady state or circular economy working for general ecological, social, and economic flourishing. Neo-feudalism is also a steady state economy, one in which growth is essentially nil or close to it, but characterized not by some harmonious, socially sustaining socioeconomic life. Rather, it is one in which the rate of return on capital lies at its historic norms of 4 to 5% for a rather much larger and much more comfortable ruling class than existed in pre-modern periods across the world, coupled with the conditions for at least two distinct, if certainly overlapping, surplus populations. First, a massive number of essentially socioeconomically expendable people, no longer needed for the basic stable reproduction of the sated and well-off, who face direct, permanent ecological adversity. For example, think of the UN's estimate that 1 to 2 billion people will no longer have adequate access to water by about 2050. And second, a large body also facing severe economic and ecological constriction of what one might term neo-serfs, people who work in basic production and extraction, maintenance, and non-essential service functions. In between these groups and a ruling class would be a third mass, perhaps, loyal retainers, those who perform high-level service, especially governance and security. I want to be careful with my language, as such a scenario might simply seem an exercise in dystopian speculation, or of the increasingly popular genre of climate doom-mongering. But rather, I think coming to know right-wing climate realism and its worst possibilities is coming to know an enemy, to have a clear-sighted view of its concrete realities, its politics, and its passions, so that we might cultivate and externalize our own. This particular reactionary climate realism scenario is hardly certain. It could take differing forms across different geographies. In some places, we might see neo-feudal company towns as described above, but in others, virulently and exclusive nationalist states. In some places, massive sacrifice zones, as already exist around key points for global extraction of rare earth metals, and others, a kind of rump state working in concert with private powers. We can have Jair Bolsonaro calling for extractive genocide, or we can have the burgeoning green-black explicit eco-fascist politics forming across Europe. Or maybe just Dianne Feinstein saying that doing otherwise just costs too much. The point is that in some form, it is not only plausible and possible, but probable. Such a world need not be characterized by some cataclysmic break with this one, nor would it be unrecognizable. Part of what makes this such a plausible outcome is that it is another intensification of this existing world. Approximately 25% of the American workforce already is employed protecting wealth and surveilling other workers, 1 in 4. That is a trend one can see in other countries, and it tracks inequality. As we've already seen, the business as usual world is a radically unequal one. But such an intensification of phenomena like this would be so significant as to be a qualitative shift. Such a world is not speculative fiction. It is an existing trend. Positions like this are usually chalked up to corruption, greed, short-sightedness, or a host of cognitive biases. But the world projected in the vision of tiers of private protection is not short-sighted at all. If anything, it is the assumption that climate change is universally apocalyptic that is the exemplar of cognitive confusion and blurred vision. The argument is that whatever protections wealth and power afford will evaporate at some degree of warming, some delta X scenario. Of course, there must be some variable, some X, at which universal effects to such an extent really do begin. But that is not what we are talking about. Most business as usual scenarios put the Earth on track for about a change in 3 or a change in 5 degrees by the end of the 21st century, even accounting for the possibility that feedback loops would trigger a faster rate of warming or lock in a particular pathway. And when one wants to add social impacts to the already complex ecological picture, war, resource distribution, land use, and so on, projections are even more difficult. A business as usual scenario by 2100 is almost certainly characterized by mass levels of direct and indirect deaths, rampant disease in some regions, billions in food and water insecurity, climate refugees, racial conflict, and so on. The more aggressive forms of what I have been calling right-wing climate realism are what Christian Parenti more poetically calls the politics of the armed lifeboat. However, Parenti deems such politics as bound to fail, not on grounds of insufficient adaptation and mitigation or catastrophic outcomes, but rather because if climate change is allowed to destroy whole economies and nations, this is Parenti, no amount of walls, guns, barbed wire, armed aerial drones, or permanently deployed mercenaries will be able to save one half of the planet from the other. But this is highly uncertain, not particularly likely, and certainly not automatic. Some projections which try to synthesize ecological and social systemic impact project in terms of deaths alone 100 million climate deaths increase between now and 2030. That is a shocking number, rounding out to about 6 to 10 million deaths per year. But the same exact models note that the world currently experiences some 4.5 million climate deaths per year, right now, today. Thinking about current realities of economic inequality, warfare, and grinding poverty suggests that some version of this world, that is this global system, is far more capable of absorbing truly catastrophic climate impacts discussed in likely scenarios than many anticipate. A brief survey of colonial history shows that with even more staggering odds and sometimes greater access to wealth and resources than the bound to fail scenario, there was no automatic reversal or chaotic karma for the wretched of the earth. To think with a historical example, only a few hundred clerks, owners, and managers, and several thousand soldiers subdued an army of 50,000 at the Battle of Plassey to establish the rule of the British East India Company in Bengal in 1757. At that time, the size of the capital city of Calcutta alone was approximately 1 million people. By the time the East India Company captured Delhi at the beginning of the 19th century, its private security force had grown to some 260,000 men and would come to rule the entire subcontinent of over 200 million. At the height of company rule, the force was approximately 350,000. This was, of course, not a benign period. And it is even one in which we can already see a set of social ecological relations. As Mike Davis notes, there is little evidence that rural India ever experienced subsistence crises on the scale of the Bengal catastrophe of 1770 before company rule. Mughal India was generally free of famine until the 1770s. During the Bengal famine, some 10 million people died in one of the first great natural disasters that were anything but. Unlike contemporary political ecology in the Anthropocene, in which human impacts can be causally associated with truly ecological forces, these earlier episodes were far more straightforward. New forms of capitalist imperialism transformed cyclical events like El Nino into natural disasters. The famine was not the result of the ecological cycles, but rather of a metabolic relationship between a host of company policies, especially grain export, and the ecological system. In the Bengal famine of the late 18th century, such policies included both the continued promotion of cultivating land for export crops, but also company-imposed taxation exacted with extraordinary violence. Both continued even in the face of 2 years of ecological adversity. The next century or so of East India Company and then direct British Raj rule was nothing short of, quote, free market economics as a mask for colonial genocide, similar to that of the Great Hunger in Ireland, and even in some cases directed by the same exact personnel. Millions would continue to die of famine all across the subcontinent. Even areas where rainfall was adequate were inundated with the social spillover effects of capitalist colonization. Early experiments were conducted that eerily prefigured later Nazi research on minimal human sustenance diets in concentration camps. Another quote. In finding just the optimal level at which capital could simultaneously extract ecological value and still generate profit through productive activity. Just as capital will inexorably chase the incredible profitability that fossil energy provides today, regardless of human costs, grain merchants preferred to export a record 6.4 million hundredweight of wheat in 1877 to 1878, one of the periods of most intense famine. Up to the end, such practices continued in British-ruled India. Winston Churchill reached the empirically untrue Malthusian argument that famine was the result of rampant population growth of the poor. At least 3 million Indians died in the Bengal famine of 1943, as Churchill and his government insisted on policies of maximal grain extraction and stockpiling for British use. This time, there was no corresponding weather event. There was no even natural famine. It was a man-made famine, as Amartya Sen wrote, or, in more ordinary terms, genocide. British rule in India lasted over 2 centuries. At its high point, colonization forces numbered approximately 500,000 soldiers across the subcontinent, ruling over 300 million people. It is not that Indians did not revolt, strike, and fight back. They did, throughout the period of the Company and the Raj, but rather that 1/5 of 1% of the population was perfectly capable of withstanding these actions. India is no isolated case either. Integration into the world market walked hand in hand with new economic ecological disasters across the world. In the late 19th century, these could be witnessed not only in India, but in Algeria, Egypt, Brazil, Angola, Queensland, Fiji, and Samoa. The hand of empire and the invisible hand replaced staple crops with cash crops. Natural famine followed. Anti-colonial and on the other side of the world, slave revolts, rebellions, and revolutions did occur, and sometimes even achieving legal and formal decolonization. The Haitian Revolution at the beginning of the 19th century is one of the paradigmatic cases. Cedric Robinson gives half the pertinent story here. In Haiti, between 1791 and 1804, slave armies managed to defeat the French, Spanish, and English militaries, the most sophisticated militaries of the day, allowing Haiti to become the first slave society to achieve the permanent destruction of the slave system and to achieve formal independence. But CLR James provided the other. If Haitians thought that imperialism was finished with them, they were mistaken. Haiti would be, in the colder language of the 20th century, contained by the global market, subordinated in that market, and by its imperialist homes, frequently besieged by blockade or direct military intervention to this day. But there was nothing automatic about any of these processes, which lasted in many cases a century or even centuries. And even after all that time, few would claim that the world is decolonized today. If anything, it is less that the world has become decolonized and that the colonial relation has become more omnipresent. Anti-colonial struggles are not automatically, inevitably, or historically bound to fail. There have been many real victories achieved in the struggle for decolonization, and the politics of a left-wing climate realism is a mode of broadened anti-colonial struggle as much in the metropole, that's here, as in the periphery. It is, in its simplest form, the very real, very possible adaptation and mitigation scenario for an almost utopian flourishing for the vast majority of people on Earth. Put differently, left-wing climate realism is the politics and possibilities of a world relieved from social, economic, and ecological despair and exhaustion. But right-wing climate realism is hardly bound to fail either. It is perfectly imaginable because the world as we know it already absorbs the scaling horrors of the Anthropocene. It is perfectly imaginable because the colonial relation has necessarily adapted and spread over time. It is perfectly imaginable because the world we actually know and the one we can observe through the historical record makes the politics of the armed lifeboat far from a bad gamble from those whose stake promises a payout. Between the statistical image of the most impacted in the global south most intensely, but within countries like the United States or Australia too, in scenarios like the tier protections of the Californian wildfires, climate-proof flood reconstruction, or more dramatic considerations of resource wars and instability, it begins to become clear that although we all inhabit the same ecological niche, we don't really share one climate. It is here that we can really start to see a more accurate stereoscopic view of the Anthropocene as it actually stands. The stereoscope, invented in the 19th century, allows a viewer to see two images at once, such that the brain can perceive a three-dimensional image. Walter Benjamin introduced the idea of a stereoscopic view in his work on history, perception, and politics. At any given moment, one could grasp a more accurate, more meaningful view of history by replacing that static single image with a stereoscopic one, bringing an analytically and or politically relevant constituted past into view that enhances our initial glance, that creates a three-dimensional portrait of the present. Such a portrait breaks the myth that there is a universal history in favor of a multiplicity of histories. This, again, has both an analytic and political dimension. The story that is told, which comprises both, is more accurate, but also the latter story is a story, the flat one, is only a story of the victors, this is Benjamin's quote. Telling it is not only inaccurate, it is to empathize with the rulers who are the heirs of past conquerors. Empathizing with the victor invariably benefits current rulers. Or think of that ecological, economic, and political nexus in the 18th or 19th century colonialism. To see that image simultaneously with a more static image of the present gives a fuller, three-dimensional image, a clearer understanding of the landscape today. That image is resonant with the present moment and politically charged. Benjamin invites us to conduct a sort of spectrum analysis, to look for this sort of resonance, just as a physicist determines the presence of ultraviolet light in the solar spectrum. If we learn to see stereoscopically, we find not the flat tableau of triumphal procession, but a true three-dimensional image of the present emerges. It is just such a view that we need to understand the political story of the Anthropocene. In one image is a vast number of people, many already feeling and experiencing the catastrophe that even a change in 1.5 or 2 degrees world promises. Such impacts are in no way equal, stretching from out-and-out deaths of millions to millions more as refugees, others facing chronic food and resource shortages and attendant conflicts, and still others locked into tiered castes of misery. In the other image is a world that has not only profited from 30 years of denial and delays, but stands to continue to reap dividends and increase the already substantial permanence of such social structures. In that image, there is no urgency around a change in 1.5 or change in 2 degrees. It's not that adaptation is not possible in such scenarios, it's that it's highly restricted. And in the meantime, there is money to be made and power to be secured in that exclusive heaven's high water. The better climate plan might be for some to not just build lifeboats, but protect them further still. Miami might be lost, but as one climate scientist quietly observed, off the record, that's not the case for Manhattan. Manhattan and all those new luxury climate adaptations would likely be protected by seawalls or surge barriers. Only that form of adaptation would almost certainly come at the cost of outer-lying areas of, say, Brooklyn or southern Queens. Perhaps this might seem outlandish to some, but it is the basic logic of the discount rate, the mainstream macroeconomic approach to climate change, just relieved of some of its ideological distortions. The late economist William Nordhaus, who was widely celebrated for creating the discount rate, openly advocated, as many mainstream and even liberal voices do today, for a change in 3 to a change in 3.5 degree world, right in the middle of the business as usual scenario. This is well in line with many of the right-wing climate realisms we've just explored. This is the Rex position. Just as we are all the beneficiaries of growth, as the fairy tale goes, we are all better off with a high discount rate. The idea that some universal we is better this way contradicts literally everything we've learned about current ecological realities, let alone projected one. The idea that profit maximization actually benefits everyone belies a world of stark and growing inequality. Whether it promises doom, salvation, or even just modest improvements, the universal story truly does serve only the powerful. Although so seemingly distant from the kind of theoretical lens Benjamin was exploring in the late 1930s, the discount rate turns out to be the exquisite illustration of Benjamin's arguments about time, history, and power. Here, We can finally see diverging climates, diverging interests, and even diverging times. While it is not the case that everyone will die in the next 10 to 20 years or even longer, it is the case that for billions of people and even majorities in global north countries, that they have strong interests in immediate and radical transformation. This is expressed, this is felt, although not necessarily yet, as climate politics. At the same time, there are those that have no rush at all. This is not about people's moral characters, but actually just a relatively straightforward comparison of structural interests. Nordhaus is in a weird way right. It's not worth the trillions of dollars or losses, or the trillions of dollars of losses, or the trillions of dollars of losses to mitigate so quickly. It's that he's only right for one of those images, for one small set of people with inordinately large amounts of power. When we look stereoscopically, we can see the full three-dimensional image, not of single pathways, but of two diametrically opposed worlds, where even ecology does not unite all people. Simply put, we're not all in this together. Thank you.